Wish we had time for questions, but you'll have to, I've got to get 2 more people in before noon. The other person that came this morning, and we're glad to have him here, is Dick Russell, so I'm going to have him talk to you, and then Ben Rogers. Carol Tyler, who was mentioned in your chapter, personal secretary to Bobby Baker, was also a secretary working for Senator Smathers in Florida, who's tied to the mafia ring down there with Tatum Chubby Wooford and the people that took Nixon gambling and later scandals. And at the time that she worked for Smathers, 2 other people worked in the office as secretaries. One had been a stripper for Jack Ruby in Dallas, and the other is a woman named Mary Jo Kopechne. If that tells you anything. These things...
And Tyler's death was suspicious.
Yes,
too.
Tyler went down a plane in Alaska like Hale Boggs did. So if Dick's here and can come up. This is Dick Russell. He wrote an early book many of you probably know called The Man Who Knew Too Much. I think it's now been eclipsed by Vincent Bugliosi for size, but I told him once he should have called it The Man Who Wrote Too Much. But Dick Russell's also just recently released a lot of his other investigative articles in a compendium called On the Trail of the JFK Assassins. So,
If I may say one comment, because in my manuscript I've written about you, and you knew too much, and to me, one of the most poignant things in your book is the fact that Homer Thornberry becomes the judge in the case, and he took Johnson's place in Congress. Johnson called Thornberry twice before the trial took place, and they switched judge. Homer Thornberry was not supposed to be the judge. There was a switch made. And so that shows you that what this man has written is right on the money, because it ties right into what I'm talking about.
Thank you, Ed.
Okay, so
see you.
give him help.
thanks, Ed.
Okay.
Well, good to see you all.
Oh, you want to put a mic
I'll
on there?
attach it for you. Go ahead.
What Ed was referring to there was the arrest of Richard Nagel on September 20th, 1963, and when he walked into a bank in El Paso, Texas, and shot 2 holes in the ceiling and intentionally got himself arrested. Seized from his car that day were 2 notebooks. One of them surfaced eventually in 1975, which was what sparked my interest in Nagel originally. And in that notebook there were listings for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, for the Cuban Embassy in Mexico City, and that led me to Nagel's doorstep in 1975 and eventually to my book, The Man Who Knew Too Much. And the judge who came into the case, Homer Thornberry, after Nagel was arrested, he was railroaded through prison for 4.5 years. And Thornberry was indeed the judge who came into the case in January of '64 and did his best to put the lid on the whole thing. So I'm going to visit with you a little bit today about, last time I was here in Dallas was in 2003 for the 40th anniversary, and I don't know if any of you were here, but Jesse Ventura, who was the wrestler who became governor of Minnesota, was here that day, and he was the only public official actually to speak on the grassy knoll and or on the at Dealey Plaza, and he's long had a lot of suspicions about the case. I gave him my book that day, and we ran into each other a few years later in a bar in Baja, Mexico, of all places, where he had just moved. And I was writing there over that winter and then also the following winter. So this led to a collaboration, and they have the book in the back. My book previous to this one, On the Trail of JFK Assassins, was a book I did with Jesse Ventura called Don't Start the Revolution Without Me. And it's got some really interesting stuff in it about his visit with Castro, asking Castro about the Kennedy assassination, and also the CIA being put on him, Ventura, both in Cuba and prior, when he was forced to have a meeting with all these agents. So it's an interesting story, and it was because I came here that I ended up having that collaboration with him. Tell you a little bit, just briefly, about how this new book is a compilation of my articles for a lot of different papers that were willing to take a chance in the 70s, like the Village Voice in particular, and Harper's Weekly, New Times. A lot of them don't exist anymore. Later, High Times magazine. The big media would never cover this event in any kind of way that indicated a conspiracy, certainly. And I have a chapter about that and some of the big media's ties, in fact, to the CIA that were revealed back in the 1970s by Carl Bernstein, the reporter who did the Watergate, broke the Watergate story. But it's partly a memoir of my experiences tracking down all these strange characters, some of whom I came to dismiss, most of whom I came to dismiss actually, as people maybe telling half-truths, but not certainly the people on the level of Nagel or Antonio Vecchiana, whom I believed unequivocally were telling me the truth as far as they would. So it's part memoir, part a compilation of my articles, and part new investigative material that I developed after my first book came out in 1992. And some of that has to do with the Nagel case. Some of it has to do with MK-Ultra, which was a CIA program to control human behavior, which was not revealed publicly until 1977. I originally became interested in this, well, as a kid. I mean, I was in high school. I was a junior in high school in Kansas, actually, when President Kennedy was assassinated. And I wasn't that political at the time. Of course, the weekend affected me, as it did every American, greatly. But I didn't pay, any investigative attention to it until much later. And then a strange story. In 1971, I was traveling. I had quit my dream job with Sports Illustrated magazine. And I was a sports writer back in those days, and I had quit that job to travel around the world with a backpack and a portable typewriter, and I'd ended up in the Middle East. And first of all, I was on a boat crossing, I guess, into Jordan, when I ran into an old man named James Arthur Duff, and he was the first one to tell me that he knew Allen Dulles and people at the CIA, and his belief was that, in fact, Madame New had orchestrated the assassination as a retaliation for Diem's assassination, which Ed had just mentioned. And, that's not something I believe today, but it was curious at the time. And so he was the first guy that kind of piqued my interest in this. And then I was in the Sinai Peninsula, all the way at the bottom of the Sinai where the Red Sea is, and where Moses supposedly crossed in the Red Sea. And I was just hanging out there, and suddenly this guy came up to me and he said, would you follow me? I want to show you something. So I walked with him to the edge of the Red Sea, and he pointed to this rock, and he said, see that rock? And I said, well, yeah, that's... It was indeed. I said, that's John Kennedy, President Kennedy in profile. I said, who carved that? And he said, no one carved it. It's always been there. And he walked away. Now, that was a pretty bizarre event. And I later, just last year, I met a guy who had seen the same rock, and they call it the Kennedy Rock. And in fact, it has been sculpted by the wind over the centuries. And anyway, all this kind of led me to, in 1975, I was freelancing in New York and remembering these experiences when I was working for the Village Voice, and they sent me out to San Diego to interview Professor Richard Popkin, whom some of you may recall. He wrote a book called The Second Oswald, and quite a significant book in 1965 or 6, I believe, which was the first book to point out that there were all these multiple sightings of Oswald in different places, and there probably were at least two people involved. So Professor Popkin at that time was claiming that he had solved the Kennedy assassination, and I flew to San Diego to do a piece for the Village Voice, and it was a crazy few days. I mean, all these different media were coming in, and the professor was totally over the edge with all this, and I wrote kind of a tongue-in-cheek, I didn't really poke fun at him, but it was a piece that I couldn't really reveal what he'd gotten into. I mean, it was a fun cover story, headline, "Dear President Ford, I know who killed JFK." But the truth was that Professor Popkin really was onto something, and I think he was onto two different things that were both extremely significant. One of them had to do with a guy named Luis Castillo, who had been arrested in the Philippines in 1967 for allegedly plotting to assassinate President Ferdinand Marcos. And his behavior was very strange, and what ended up happening was that Castillo was placed under hypnosis by a man named Victor Arcega, whom I met, who was an expert in hypnosis, and ended up deprogramming him, so to speak, discovering that certain key words like sand and flowers, these kind of innocuous words would trigger Castillo, suddenly in a trance, bringing out a gun. And I mean, it was very strange stuff, but there were hundreds of pages of transcripts of these interviews that the hypnotist had conducted with Castillo. And I ended up going on the road with, first I met the hypnotist, and he was a perfectly legitimate guy, and as crazy as it seemed like there was really something to this. And went on the road to Chicago and Wisconsin, and Professor Popkin sent me and a young guy at the time also named Jeff Cohen, who later became the founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and he was a talking head on MSNBC, and he's now a professor at running a media center in one of the universities in New York. And Jeff and I, we called each other Slim and Ryan. We had code names, and we were sort of on the road tracking this Castillo character down. And indeed, we found that all these places he said that he'd been, that he'd worked in Wisconsin, all these things that came out under hypnosis were all true. The people actually lived there who he claimed were his programmers. We ended up interviewing his mother and then his ex-wife. And they also verified that Castillo was definitely some kind of agent, that he'd gone to the Philippines. And now, as I said, the MKUltra documents had not, what few remained, most of them had been destroyed by CIA then Director Richard Helms in 1973. The few that remained were released in 1977, and that was the first we knew about such things actually being real. And but one of those documents indicated that Castillo, well, first of all, the documents showed that Bordentown, New Jersey, a reformatory there, had in fact been a location for MKUltra experiments on kids or young, juvenile delinquents, and that they'd done this kind of thing. The documents had surfaced showing that there were various places in the U.S. where the CIA had been conducting these kind of experiments on young people. So Castillo, it turned out, had been at Bordentown. That's one of the places that he had been sent before he went to the Philippines. So one of the chapters in the book gets into all this Castillo information that I've never published before. And later in the book, I get into this whole, about 5 chapters on the possibility that Oswald himself was part of some MKUltra program. And I say possibility because there's no way to prove it, and of course any documents about this would long since have been destroyed. But there are some very curious things. Maybe some of you remember the testimony of William Hartogs, I think it was William Hartogs, who was he was a doctor at yes, Renatus Hartogs, exactly. And he was the psychiatrist at Youth House, where Oswald was sent in 1953 when he was a juvenile delinquent, and spent some time there. And Hartogs then was key with his testimony before the Warren Commission in painting this picture of this very isolated, very psychotic young man who was quite capable of assassinating the president. Well, Hartogs, it turned out, had a very curious history, and had in fact written a book which he denied writing, but it was on record at a trial that was held where one of his patients had sued him, called Principles of Suggestion and Autosuggestion, which was all about hypnosis. I actually interviewed Hartogs over the phone, and he was pretty defensive, and although he admitted knowing some of the key CIA people like Ewan Cameron and so on who were involved in MKUltra stuff. And apparently he'd been working with a guy named Sidney Mallitz at a big hospital in New York, and was involved in MKUltra operations back in the 1950s, and I got that verified through Milton Klein, who was an expert in hypnosis and lived in New York. So did something happen to Oswald back when he was a teenager? I think it's quite possible. And there were all kinds of other fingerprints of this as time went on. David Ferry, who was, I'm sure most of you have heard of, if you're familiar with the JFK case, had this Civil Air Patrol in New Orleans, which Oswald was part of when he was a teenager. And Ferry was an expert in hypnosis, and some of the Civil Air Patrol cadets were telling me that he used to practice hypnosis, with the kids who were part of the Civil Air Patrol. At Sugi, the Naval Air Base where Oswald was stationed in Japan, was also one of only 2 field stations overseas where the CIA conducted LSD experiments with some of the young Marines on the base. And there's a new book that just came out, I can't remember the name of it, but it literally just came out by a guy who was at Atsugi, who said that he was part of an MKUltra program while there. And then there's all kinds of rumors about what happened to Oswald when he was in Russia, or did they do some kind of messing around with his mind. I had the last interview, I think, with Sidney Gottlieb, who ran the CIA's MKUltra program for 20 years. It was a very strange guy. I mean, he lived at the time I interviewed him. He was getting pretty old. He'd been retired from the CIA for 20 years. He'd run this program since 1953 to 1973. And I went to his country place in Virginia. By this time, I remember he had sitting next to him on his table there in the living room, the Tibetan Book of the Living and Dead, and books on Oriental medicine. He was a biodynamic gardener. He'd become a Zen Buddhist. I mean, the guy had taken 60 or so acid trips in his youth, so this could have influenced him later on. But at any rate, we got along very well. He'd started a commune. I mean, he was a really interesting old guy. And in the course of our discussion that day, which I taped, and I have a long chapter about this in the book, he talked about. He just said that, yeah, Oswald could have used a, quote, Manchurian Candidate framework. Now, that was the book that Richard Condon wrote and became a movie starring Frank Sinatra and Lawrence Harvey, which was banned, actually. I mean, well, banned technically. It wasn't allowed to be shown in the United States for many, many years after the assassination. It came out in '62 about this guy who, under hypnosis or programming, sees the Queen of Spades and shoots at the president. And so Gottlieb alluded to this, and I found it very interesting, and he wouldn't come right out and say it. Then I ended up interviewing another MKUltra field agent. He was the number 2 guy under George White, who was the main field agent in this program for years, and his name was Ike Feldman, and he was pretty elderly at the time too. And I interviewed him in New York, and I'll just read you a little bit of what he had to say, because this to me was quite stunning. See, it's toward the end of the book here. Just a paragraph or so. Feldman elaborated. I heard rumors that something was given to Oswald days or weeks before he went to the Texas School Book Depository. I also heard he was brainwashed, like the Manchurian Candidate. I heard that when he was in Russia, they started to brainwash him over there. The Russians messed with him, twisted his brains. This affected him for a long time. Then somebody in this country continued to screw around with him. Whoever made the assassination plans, he was reintroduced to brainwashing, and they gave him something. I don't know what it was. After he got arrested, they claim he would gibber and jabber before he was shot. I heard Ruby was tight with the Chicago people, meaning the mafia, and some in New Orleans. When word came out that Oswald may spill his guts, they sent Ruby in. If Oswald walked, they were afraid he'd involve Giancana, Marcello, and God knows who else. I was also told that Ruby was a drug user, and after he shot Oswald, he was afraid he would have talked too much. I don't remember what kind of drugs, but he just loaded up that day. Oswald was one part of the ball field, Ruby was another part. Ruby was a half-assed racketeer, Oswald was a half-assed communist. I persisted in asking whether he had heard these rumors about mind control from high up in the American government. Feldman nodded, very high up. It was State Department people who made these comments. The real rumors came from there. So I knew this much after having lunch with Feldman. The possibility that MKUltra techniques had played a role in the Kennedy assassination was a very real one indeed. So I have about 5 chapters about this in the new book, and I think it's significant information that needs to get out there to the public, as wild as it may seem. There's also in the book, a lot of it is sort of my experiences with, well, not a lot of it, but some of it, with some of these soldiers of fortune types, so Jerry Hemming, Gordon Novell, Lawrence Howard, Harry Dean. I interviewed all these guys. Antonio Vecchiana, who I put a lot of stock in. He was a Cuban exile who was the one who first identified Maurice Bishop as a case officer who met with both him, Vecchiana, and Oswald in August of 1963. Vecchiana was deeply involved in a lot of the anti-Castro assassination plots, and eventually he was shot in the head. It was a sad thing. I mean, he told me at the time, he said, look, if you can't use my name because otherwise I'm going to end up, somebody's going to kill me. And he was talking to Gaten Fonzi of the House Select Committee on Assassinations in Miami, and didn't want me to tell Gaten, whom I was staying with actually, that he was seeing me. I had just contacted Vecchiana out of the blue. I had no idea that he knew anything. And so I didn't use his name, and then about a year went by. I mean, it was a story I probably could have made a lot of money on, and I didn't do it because I was afraid for this man. And then Jack Anderson, the columnist, broke this column called Mr. X Surfaces in the JFK Mystery. So somebody on the House Assassinations Committee leaked this story out, and you know, it was enough certainly to identify Vecchiana, even if as Mr. X, even if you didn't know who it was. So then I later did publish something naming Vecchiana in the Village Voice, and and not too long after these articles came out, after the Mr. X article, he was shot in the head outside a Trailways bus station in Miami, and he survived, and he's still alive. But he talked much less after that, and obviously for obvious reasons. You know, it was a scary. You know, I mean, I was this young kind of crazy journalist in the '70s, and it was scary at times. I mean, I remember leaving Miami that time. It was the only time a plane almost crashed that I was in, and as I said, Lawrence Howard. I won't read you the whole part of the book, but he sat across from me. First, he checked he was the guy who went to Sylvia Odio's door supposedly, and in the September of '63, and people had been claiming he was involved in a conspiracy for years. I don't think he was, and he definitely told me reasons why he wasn't. But you know, he was scared, and you know, I met him in some place in El Monte, California, and he when we got to his driveway, I remember he said, turn around, let me check your pants leg. I mean, he's checking me for guns, and then he sits across from me the entire time with a loaded pistol that I could see kind of poking out, and so it was, you know, kind of heavy. Richard Nagel, whom I won't tell you, you know, his whole story today, but subject of my first book, I met him in the fall of 1975, and we kind of had this very strange, off again, on again relationship for many years. I moved to L.A. and became a staff writer for TV Guide magazine, and so I'd go from traveling around with Bob Hope during the day to meeting Nagel sometimes in these dingy bars, and you know, sometimes taking notes, sometimes not, and trying to get him to tell me everything he would. He never would tell me everything. He was definitely involved in a small conspiracy to assassinate the president. He knew of Oswald. He was investigating Oswald. He worked as a double agent for the Russians and for the Americans, and as a confidential informant for the FBI. And he sent a warning letter to Hoover in September of '63 telling him enough to warrant the arrest of Oswald and these 2 Cuban exiles. Nagel told me at one time, talked to him on the phone, I think it was 1979, and he said, there's a lot of people in Los Angeles know who Dick Russell is. I said, really? He said, including quite a few Cubans. And I said, well, am I in any danger? And he said, no. He said, I would have told you, you know, if you were. And then he told me this story of how these 2 guys from the CIA had been sitting in a bar at the next table to us on a night when I was pretty sure I was being followed home. And he said, they told me that you taped me, and that they had this device that could pick it up. And I said, well, I didn't. I never did, even though I sometimes wished I had. But I honored his request that I not tape record him, and he said, well, he said they were so insistent on it that I figured they were making this up. Well, Nagel died under mysterious circumstances, I think, in 1995. The very week that I had given a talk in Washington before the Assassination Records Review Board, which was then, you know, releasing all these records, and they were there at my talk, and they decided after that to subpoena Nagel and get his testimony on record, and along with whatever documents he might be willing to give them. And the very day that subpoena arrived in his mailbox in Los Angeles, he was found dead in his house. And I got a call from Pete Noyes, newsman with KNBC in L.A., who told me this, and I was pretty shaken up by it. I mean, you know, I'd just given this talk. I knew that they were subpoenaing him, and I also knew that his son, from whom he was estranged, probably didn't know, so I ended up calling his son and breaking the news to him. And you know, it was a wrenching time. And the son went to Tucson, where they had found in Nagel's apartment that there was this list of where he had all these trunks that he was keeping there in this storage area in Tucson. And one of them, he had said, was a purple trunk, which was the one that contained a lot of significant documents that would surface in the event of his untimely death. Well, the purple trunk was missing. All the rest were there. The son came back to find that his apartment had been broken into in San Diego, and you know, they didn't find anything. But it was a pretty scary period. In the new book, I write some about. Now, I have an article that I wrote. The first article I ever wrote about Nagel is in the book, and which sort of summarizes a lot of what's in my larger volume. And then I have a chapter about a guy named, I should say about Nagel too, that I write about the fact that you've got to look at a timeline. He was writing about people, for example, whose names have surfaced in recent years as being significantly involved in in the assassination or cover-up or in whatever ways. He was talking about them way back in 1970 and that period, on the record. I mean, you know, and things that he wrote up about Desmond Fitzgerald with the CIA and about Manuel Artime, a Cuban exile that Nagel was shadowing and had apparently been in meetings with some people about the assassination. So he talked about Oswald looking for a place in Baltimore that he was going to move to with his wife and daughter when they were talking about killing Kennedy in Washington, D.C. at the end of September of '63. And some documents recently surfaced that say, yeah, Oswald was in Baltimore and that the FBI had looked into this. And so as the years have gone by, a lot more has come out to substantiate Nagel's story than just the notebook that was found in his car that day. And there's new material that surfaced about a man named Henry Heckscher, whom I now believe was Nagel's case officer with the CIA. And is not very well known in this whole world of the assassination. But he was involved in Project Amworld, which Lamar Waldron and others have recently written about, which was an effort to get rid of Castro that was very secret within the CIA. And Heckscher was also Manuel Artime's case officer and very close to David Phillips in Mexico City. In fact, had been involved with Phillips in the coup in Guatemala back in 1954. And so I tracked down one of Heckscher's relatives who had a lot of stuff that he had set down and left behind, and was able to ascertain that he'd been the chief of station for CIA in Japan at the time Oswald and Nagel were there in '57, '58. And that later, even though he kind of obfuscated it by saying on the one hand he was with Far East Division, on the other hand he was definitely involved with Cuban and Latin American affairs between 1960 and '63, and he was a top aide to Fitzgerald and worked closely with Phillips. And anyway, I have a new chapter in the book that points to Heckscher as being someone who definitely would have been likely to have involvement with, certainly with Nagel and perhaps with Oswald, although I have nothing to prove that. What time we got here? I'll just talk for a few more minutes, and then I'll take some questions if you have them. The new book ends with an interview that I did with Doug Horn. I've never been someone who was that fascinated or intrigued by the medical evidence. I don't know why. I mean, a lot of other people have looked at it and done very significant work, and maybe I just found it too confused, technical or grisly, whatever. I don't know. But Doug Horn is the guy who was with the Assassination Records Review Board and was in charge of reviewing the medical evidence and also interviewing, getting depositions from the autopsy doctors, Humes and Boswell and Fink. And he just came up with some extraordinary analysis, a whole timeline that shows there were 2 autopsies that night. There was a fake one that began around 6:30. Then there was another casket that came in for the official one. There was a whole substitution thing going on with the president's body. And he elaborates on it to such a degree that I think there's no doubt that Horn is onto something huge. 2 autopsies, 2 brain exams. Talks also about the Zapruder film and how it was quite likely altered that weekend at a CIA photo lab run by Kodak in Rochester, New York. I'm not going to go into all the details right now, but I ended the book with that because I think it's extremely significant. And I guess I will open it up for questions at this point. A couple other things I'll mention to you that are in the book. One is a chapter about Marina Oswald Porter, whom I got to know after my first book came out, and ended up bringing her under the auspices of a wealthy friend in the Boston area, bringing her to Boston in 1993, and we had this huge meeting at my house with lawyers, a bunch of lawyers there. I mean, Marina at that point really wanted to get this case reopened, and she was convinced that her late husband had been wrongly accused, and we had this big meeting around my fireplace. Jim Lazar was there, and Gaten Fonzie, and Daniel Ellsberg showed up that night. It was a pretty amazing day, and the sad thing was none of these great minds could come up with a way that the case could actually be reopened at this late juncture. And I remember the end of that night, a violinist friend playing Song of the Lark, beautifully, really for Marina, and a lot of us had tears in our eyes because it was I think she came away feeling like the whole effort had failed, and you know, she it just wasn't going to be able to happen. So that's a story that I think is, you know, significant too, that she's feels this way after initially believing the Warren report, and of course being just, as she said, I was a zombie in those days when, after the assassination, when everybody was grilling her and FBI agents were trying to fool around with her. I mean, you know, it was not a, you can imagine, a fun time. And on a lighter note, I tell the story of my visit to KGB headquarters. In 1991, I went to Moscow to cover, Gorbachev was still in power then. I think it was the last year where there was still a Soviet Union. And I went to cover the first grassroots environmental conference between U.S. and, I mean, I write a lot about the environment, and I went for a magazine to cover this conference between Russian and American environmentalists. And I figured, well, while I'm here, why not give it a shot? Because I knew that Nagel, in 1968, after he got out of prison, had been taken off a train by the East German authorities initially, and ended up in Moscow, where he said he had filled out a confession. Basically, the Russians wanting to know, well, why didn't he kill Oswald as they had ordered him to before the assassination? What was really going on? So the KGB would have had to have had this in their files, I presume. So I won't tell the whole story. But I ended up taking a young woman who was with an environmental group who spoke fluent Russian with me to knock on the door of the KGB, and the cab driver just couldn't believe it. He said, "Lubyanka?" I said, "Yeah." He says, on this street no one even passes. And then he said, "In this building," he said, "there are," he points to the building finally, the long street, long block of KGB. He says, "In this building there are as many floors below as there are floors above." Well, that kind of freaked me out a little bit too. But when I finally got in, and the ruse that I used to get in was I knocked on the door, and this soldier, it was a side door, the cabbie took us around it, not to the main entrance but to a side door. And so this soldier came and answered, and I said I was an American journalist, and I was here for my appointment with Major General Alexander Karbynov, whom I read about in National Geographic. The KGB had hired a PR guy. So of course I'd never had no appointment with Major General Karbynov, but I thought maybe it sounded good. So they didn't know what to do, and they were very flustered, and they let me in. And eventually, this guy came and took us into the main entrance to KGB, and when they started asking me questions, and, you know, did you, well, it's all being translated, of course. And how do you like Moscow? And I said, oh, I like it very much. I went to Red Square, and I went to the cathedral, and I thought, oh, and of course Lenin's tomb. I saw Lenin's tomb. That was really great. And then they asked me what brings me here, and I didn't really want to answer in front of all the guards and the soldiers and everything, and I never had to, because just then at the top of this long flight of carpeted stairs, the doors to the elevator opened, and this guy just stood there looking down. And finally, he walked down and said, "Would you follow me, please?" And luckily, the elevator went up, and we ended up going to this big conference room with, where there was a bar, and there was another KGB guy in there, and I looked up, and there was a camera trained on me from the ceiling, and I sat down. He said, "So, what brings you here?" So I said, "Well, I'm investigating the Kennedy assassination." And one of the KGB guys said, "Well, there have been many books about the assassination. There was Manchester, there was this book, there was that book. Why another book?" So then I started telling them about Nagel, and we ended up, their ears perked up when I said that he was an agent for the CIA and for the KGB. And then they wanted to know his name and, you know, all these kind of things. And so I said, well, I can't tell you the name of my source. And it went on for about a half an hour, and finally they said, well, here's what you must do. I am telling you most of the story, but you must write a letter. And you must name your source, and you have to drop it in a box at 22 Kuznetsky Most. I still remember the name of the street. And we will get back to you in the United States. So I said, okay, I'll do that. And we're leaving in the elevator. I remember one of them turns to me and said, I turned and I said, you get many people dropping in off the street? Just kind of like this. And he says, in the past, never. He says, today we have some legitimate journalists that come. I don't know, I guess he didn't consider me too legitimate, I'm not sure. But, so then we went back to this hotel. I don't think it was the Hotel Oswald stayed in, but Metropole, I think. And we were sitting, I wanted to go in, I had these two I had another American girl with me who had come up to me on the bus and was also at this environmental conference and said, I've heard you're going into KGB, and my father has read me spy novels all my life. I just have to go. And I told her, well, it could be rather dangerous. I don't know if I should. But anyway, I gave in. She was cute. And I said that she could come too. So here I was with these two American girls going into the KGB headquarters. So the two of us then go afterwards to this, to this hotel. And we sit, because I want to remember everything while I can and, get it all set down. It's a really great story. And so we walk in, I see this young guy reading a copy in English of Jean Le Carré, a spy novel. So I thought, we'll sit next to him. So we sit down and we start talking about the KGB headquarters, what it was like, what it looked like. And this one girl, the one who'd come up to me on the bus, she had a great memory for detail. I mean, she had observed everything, all the decor and what the people were wearing and all the stuff that I couldn't remember, because I was so intent on the moment with the people. And meantime, the guy with the reading the Le Carré book gets up and he just disappears. So the next day, the guy I was rooming with at the conference, he was with Earthwatch, and he goes into town to see some friends of his from the U.S., and he comes back and he says, "You're not going to believe what happened." I said, "Really, what?" He says, "Well, I went to see this friend of mine." And he was really uptight, very paranoid, and he says, "David, you're not going to believe what happened to me yesterday. I was sitting in this hotel and I was reading my book, and all of a sudden this guy comes in and he starts talking about the KGB and all these things. He says, I think I'm being set up." So then David told me, he said, "Well, that's okay. That was my roommate at this conference." Anyway, go back to the States, and the end of the story is they never did. I did put the letter in the box, and they never did get back to me, not unexpectedly. Gorbachev was, stepped down, or, Yeltsin took over about 6-9 months later. And one day, a couple of years later, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was visiting a friend in the environmental world, Lois Gibbs, the Love Canal person, if some of you recall. And I'd known Lois for a long time, and she started telling me this story about how she'd had all kinds of trouble in her office, and there was this young woman who'd come to work for her and disrupted, started accusing people of embezzling money and this and that, and apparently she'd gone to another environmental organization and done the same thing. And I said, "What was her name?" And she tells me, and it was the name of the girl who'd come up to me on the bus and wanted to go along into KGB headquarters, and she was an agent. So I'd let an agent walk in with me to the KGB, and I was stunned. I said, "My God, Lois, I got to tell you this story." So anyway, I just told you that whole chapter of the book, but it was quite. So with that, I guess if we have time for a couple of questions, I'll answer
What's
them.
the name of your book again?
The new one is called On the Trail of the JFK Assassins. They're selling it, I guess, in the hallway. And the first one is called The Man Who Knew Too Much, which came out in 2003 in a revised edition. Yes?
Were you a stringer for Sports Illustrated or full-time?
I was a full-time reporter.
So you went from college straight to that?
I actually got hired by them after my junior year.
That's pretty impressive. That's the granddaddy of sports writing. I was a sports writer before I got into
Were you?
teaching, yeah.
Yeah, I know. And it was, I was every summer they'd hire an intern, and I was in Kansas, going to school, University of Kansas, and I was writing sports for everybody, sporting news and you name it, and I was good. I mean, they hired me, and then they hired me full time. But in those years, suddenly my whole life had been sports, and then my interest had begun to change. I woke up one day and realized, wow, there's a Vietnam War, there's a civil rights movement, there's Robert Kennedy, So I quit after 7 months full time and just took off with a backpack and a portable typewriter and traveled around the world for a year and a half and never looked back.
You just mentioned Robert Kennedy, you mentioned the Manchurian Candidate issues. Have you done anything to follow up on any of the other assassinations or assassination attempts, and to maybe talk to some of these people who are still living that are involved in those? Tell us about that.
Well, a little bit. I mean, I've done a couple of magazine pieces on the King assassination. I interviewed years ago Jerry Owen, the preacher who knew Sirhan Sirhan. Didn't really tell me too much, but I did interview him on tape. And I was very curious about the Sirhan case because there it's much more clear cut that he was acting under hypnosis, that he got some kind of trigger and he walked, he doesn't even remember what happened. And there,
Discussion of Hinckley was.
there is, and these things were,
He's alive. You'll talk to him, yeah.
well, it's pretty hard to do. And plus Sirhan is, he doesn't recall what happened. And but I think there's a tremendous amount of evidence. It even came out at his trial that by experts testifying on hypnosis that it looked like somebody had messed with his mind. So that's actually much more clear cut than the Oswald story that I recount. But these kinds of things were going on. I think all 4 assassinations of the 60s, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, the 2 Kennedys, were much more than lone crazed gunmen that we've been told they were. And it was basically an attempt to totally change the direction of this country, which they succeeded in doing. And I don't think the country's ever recovered from that period. And that's why, I've been obsessed at different times in my recent life with trying to get the truth out about what happened. And
I think it'd be a huge public service to know all the truth about that. So.
well, I don't know that we ever will, unfortunately, but I wish I could say, oh yeah, somebody's going to solve it or somebody's going to come forward and talk, but it hasn't happened yet. And but now I feel anyway like we have the country has a new chance with Obama as president, and I just hope that they protect him because there will be forces out to get him for sure. Yes.
You heard Dr. Weck say he didn't believe that the body was altered, but you think there were 2 autopsies. Other than body alteration, could there have been any other reason for the 2 autopsies?
As I say, I don't know. I'm not an expert in the medical evidence. Certainly, I've never looked at it like Dr. Wecht or many, many other people. So I'm basing what I put in the book. This is an interview with Doug Horn, who I think sounded very credible to me, and I felt like his story ought to be out there on the public record. So I personally can't think of another reason there would be. But if there were, and Doug Horn made a good case for it, then something clearly, a big cover-up was going on with the military right from the very beginning.
Could be that they were just trying to remove bullets other than the Mannlicher Carcano.
Well, that's possible. Yes, absolutely.
Dick, I hate to cut the questions off, but I've got to try to get Ben Rogers in.
Oh, yes.
And then are you going to come up the knoll with us?
I will, yeah.
Okay, so we'll have a chance to keep talking to Dick,
Yeah.
but thank you so much for...
Okay, glad I get time. Thank you. How do you get it out? You can just take it off. I can't see it.
And this is Ben Rogers. He's the curator at the Pogue Political Library at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, who's been gathering together an amazing amount of work, a great collection based on donation of materials from Penn Jones archives and work. And Penn Jones was an early investigative reporter of the Midlothian Mirror, who was here on the day the Kennedy was killed, went to the luncheon, and then drove back to Dealey Plaza and began an investigation then that led to 4 books, Forgive My Grief, he called them, and numerous essays in the Midlothian Mirror. And he was famous for tracking the witness deaths. But this collection not only has his material, but it's getting material from Jack White, I know, and a lot of other people are starting to donate things from out here at the Texas end. And Ben works with a lot of students in library science, and I know one of the things, he's got an amazing collection there of scanned covers of all the newspapers in the country on 9/11, full-size scan machine, and a really interesting website that you need to go to. So I asked him to come and update us, and then sometimes we arrange a drive down on Sunday to see the collection after we end our conference. So put this on you. Hopefully that's good enough. Is that good enough, Ralph?
And the sheet in your hand is the backup in case the PowerPoint doesn't work. It's going to work. I've given you a card here. We are a congressional archive. We have the papers of 12 U.S. congressmen, papers of former Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock, several Texas legislators, some federal judge Sam Johnson, some other judges. Then we have then we have papers of the Kennedy assassination, papers just about Kennedy's life in general. We have the 9/11 collection. We have an editorial cartoon collection, which we have a big exhibit on now. And there are probably 15 or 20 ancillary collections to the congressional collections and legislative collections. We're putting up a new website on JFK. We're transferring everything in the library from the old HTML to a new CMS, which is much more constrictive, and we're not happy about it, and it's not very pretty. But we're going to show you what we've got today and invite you to come down. I put the website address on here. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay.
If you let me know, I'll advance it.
Yeah, I'll go. So there's the information you have there, and the next slide is what the website looks now at the moment. Along the left-hand side are the names of everybody that we have collections for, which I can't read. The first thing up there, we'll go to the next page, which is newsletters. It's just my eyes. These are screenshots and not the clearest things in the world. The newsletters, we've tried to collect as many assassination newsletters as possible. We have over 40 titles now. There are 822 issues. And if you look at the next page, you can click on a title in the list and it will go to a list of those issues we have. We put the issue there and the first headline for that issue. So you can, by Google, go by topics, will give you the topic also. And then if you click on any of those lines, the next slide will show you, it will give you the cover of that newsletter. So you can see what it actually looked like. We have photocopied all the newsletters and put them in the notebooks. So a researcher comes in, they don't have to use the original newsletter, they can use the copies. The next slide, we've done the same thing with magazines. We have 420 magazine articles. They start in 1959. They go through 2000, I think. I'm not sure how far they go. If you click on a year there, you will pull up the next slide, which is a picture of the cover of each magazine, along with the title of the article that's in that magazine related to Kennedy. These are general interest magazines, not specifically assassinated related, but we're appealing to secondary school children as well as university students as well as researchers all over the country. If you go to the magazine section, you can download the whole file and go to your local public library and pull up these magazines. You don't have to contact us for them. The newsletters would be much more difficult to find at a public library, but you can contact us and get copies of those. After the magazines, then we've put some JFK links, and if you've Googled, you know there are hundreds of thousands of JFK links. So we pulled a few together by subject matter. So you can go to a particular subject, it'll give you some half a dozen or so links to JFK related materials. And if you know good sites that are not there, let us know and we can add them to them. If you click on any of these, then you'll go to the main headline. And we didn't put 100,000 there. There's only maybe 30 or 40. And the next slide shows you the site for Jack White. He's in his 80s. He's a photo analyst, testified with the House Select Committee. He also was a consultant with Oliver Stone's film. But he's now into September 11th photo analyst research. He lives in Fort Worth. I go see him every 2 or 3 months and take back another load of papers of his. And we copy everything that he has. Unfortunately, right now we're working on his correspondence. He had to throw it in the box filing system. If he got a letter, he read it and threw it in the box. So we're slowly getting those boxes from him and arranging them by correspondent. So if you click on the first thing up there about Jack White, and then it'll tell you correspondence. We have the correspondence that we've separated so far alphabetically, and it tells you what is in the file, not just correspondence, because a lot of it is manuscripts, a lot of it articles, whatever people send him. We've listed it on the website. Right now we're working on 4 more boxes, and I have 3 boxes waiting. I have 2. All of our work is done by students, so it takes a while at 10 hours a week to get it all done, because they have to separate it, then photocopy it, and then make new folders for it. We've already done 174 videos from Jack White we've converted to DVD. We've also converted 120 cassette tapes to MP3 files. Most recently, we finished his 61 tapes on the House Select Committee recordings. I could not find anyone on the internet that had converted those from cassette to a digital file. And we have copies of the House Select Committee broadcast from Jack White, Penn Jones, and A Lady in California. So we have 3 chances of getting that off of PBS at the time. Where are we now in the slides? Correspondence, and then after correspondence, we have a thing there about cassette tapes. When he clicks through that, you can see that and you can go to all this online and read it a lot better than here. But all the contents of the cassette tapes are listed, and there are a lot of interviews with people that Jack White got from other people. He didn't do them himself. We have the videos, we have the cassette tapes, and we have similar materials from Penn Jones. We didn't have a slide of that. I've presented that here before, but we've completed the Penn Jones papers, and the entire finding aid is listed on the website. All the manuscripts, published and unpublished, all the newspapers, all the cassettes and films that he had, plus his World War II correspondence. Now, on Gary Shaw, he loaned us a number of newsletters, and all of those linked to the other list of newsletters, and we have some other materials of Gary Shaw to put up there also. But he gave us a newsletter called Truth. It was just mimeographed in purple ink. And that particular newsletter, instead of just the cover of it, we did the entire newsletter, and that's on the website. I think it was done in Europe. The list that's online will tell you who published the newsletter and their address at the time, and whether we have it on microfilm or the hard copy. So after Gary Shaw, the next slide deals with JFK Lancer, our compatriots, and they have loaned us materials also, some of their cassettes, videos, and microfilm. So we have a list for those also. Now the next entry on the list is a little unusual. It's Marguerite Oswald. Her papers are at TCU. We've contacted TCU and gotten a list of the finding aid. So we have it cataloged in our library. You don't have to go to TCU. You can contact us about that also. If you come to us to research, you can see what they have. We've also contacted Texas Tech and have a copy of the finding aid for Wagner Carr and his papers related to JFK. On Marguerite Oswald is the book Aftermath of an Execution. And these are all the photographs from that book of Oswald's funeral. If you click to the next slide, you'll see a picture of the cover of that book. And there's a picture in there of the newsmen who were pallbearers at the funeral, Hugh Ainsworth and a few other men that were there. We didn't put the text. There's not much text in the book. It just explains the pictures. But we thought it was interesting because that would be an unusual publication that you might not find in your local library. The next slide we go, is John Kling? Oh, click Kellen. Oh, I forgot to turn the page over right. Okay, he has sent us tapes that he got from Hood College of Markham. And I went to Hood College this summer and talked to them, and they are digitizing a lot of the Harold Weisberg papers. But we got these tapes, and I think most of them deal with Markham interviews. So you can see that online, and not everyone can go to Colorado, and not everyone can go to Waco, but at least we have the list of what's available. And certainly not everyone can go to Hood College. It was hard to find. The next one is a guy you never heard of, Ernest Lakovich. I never heard of him either. But his grandson contacted me in Maine, of all places, and said, my grandfather collected these Kennedy materials. Can you use them? So we said, sure, and he shipped a box of them from Maine, and so we have them listed on the website. There's some early newspapers and magazine articles and things unrelated to Kennedy, but are listed there also. Even the visit of the Pope is listed there. The next person on the list is Don Grisham. He's a local Waco school teacher. Came in one day and said, I have a complete set of the Dallas police reports from the Oswald Rudy investigation. 16 volumes, including photographs he had gotten out of a dumpster. They were headed for a dumpster in Austin 30 years ago, and he was working for the state and said, don't throw those away, I'll take them. So he brought them in, we photocopied everything and cataloged them, so they're in our archive now. The next guy in the list is Bob Platt, who is a retired professor of anthropology at Tarrant County College. When he retired, he started a bookstore and political memorabilia store, but he was good friends with Penn Jones, had Penn up to speak at Tarrant County College every year, and it was through him that we obtained the Penn Jones papers, but he also had a lot of Kennedy materials, and so he gives us stuff like Jack White carload every few months. So far we have over 3,000 books from him, not all related to Kennedy, but just related to politics. And tons of political materials from obscure political organizations as he's collected. He was especially interested in futuristic organizations, World Future Society. We get all of those and we catalog them and list everything, so you can see the list online of just the Kennedy materials. We have a parallel website of just Bob Platt that has everything he's given us listed also. The next slide is Joan Jasek, who's just a little old lady out in China Springs, Texas. And she saved all her Kennedy newspapers and magazines, and her son works in the library, so he brought them to us one day. So all of those are listed there. You know, you saved it, what are you going to do with it? The next lady is Mary Love Smith. She lived in California and sat there with the radio and the cassette tape and recorded those House Select Committee tapes. And then if you click on the next slide, she also made notes in her handwritten and stuck them in the cassettes and mailed them to Penn Jones. So we have her cassettes and her notes with each cassette, what she was thinking about that day. The next guy is Larry Breen, also a local Waco teacher, walked in one day with his Kennedy materials, and we copied those, and those are in the library also. The next person, we actually don't have the papers, but you will know the name Mae Brussel. We contacted the maybrussel.com. We bought all of the radio transcriptions on MP3 files, and online they're listed as 4 discs, but when you get them, there's 6. So we have to figure out where the dividing line between 4 and 6. So eventually you'll be able to click on the DVD number and bring up the list of radio transcripts that are on that recording. On the website, her website, which is maintained by a guy in California, she died in 1988, I think, right? And John Judge was very close to her at that time. We'll have their explanation of some of the programs are online, and we're trying to gel those together because the numbers don't jive all the time online. But we bought everything from her website and cataloged it and put it in the library. The next one is a site called paperlessarchive.com. They have put together 1,600,000 public information documents as well as historical documents on 278 titles, subjects. And we have bought the entire archive on 15 DVDs in a PDF format. And we went online and copied the next slide. Oh, here in this section we've just done the JFK related materials. There's also a link there to all 278 files by topic. And when you go to the site, you can pull up a page like this for all the 278 topics. We've copied those, put them in the notebooks. If you come to research, you don't have to go online to look at that. You can look at it in the notebook. These are FBI files related to the Kennedys, Secret Service files, CIA, NSA, and other files that we can have access through the library. They're not expensive. Anybody can buy them. But we put them there, and so we're trying to archive the past for the future. No one lives forever. I'm not going to work forever. But I've started the archive. And also in my bag, let me see the bag. Where did I put the bag? There's another handout. I'm not sure I have enough paper. Oh, I'm wired, aren't I? I may have pulled it out. Did I pull it out?
No. Well, it may come off. Let me see.
Okay.
Yeah, well, one came off.
Okay. I'll send copies of these to John Judge in PDF format, and he can distribute them. I thought I had more copies than I do. I've done a newsletter And then I've also done a list of all of the assassination newsletters with a list of which files are missing. And if you know where some of these files are, or you have some of these newsletters, let us know so we can get copies and add it to it. There's also a commercial here if you need a copy of Forgive My Grief. I'm in contact with the Jones boys, and Michael will be at the Grassy Knoll today, and you can meet him. So I've talked fast. I hope you got it all, but I've given it to you in your hand, and it's online. So, so we back on schedule yet? Yes, sir.
Where you have a cassette tape where you've made this into an MP3 file, do I have to go to your library to listen to that, or is this made available to listen to online?
Well,
Be online where I can have it?
it's a lot of material to put online since we only have 2 students working on it, and everything's done by students. But probably if you found something and it was listed, we could probably put the MP3 file in an email and send it to you.
I think some of those would be pretty large to attach to the
Yeah.
email, but,
Well, we could even burn a CD and mail it to you.
okay.
So,
Name Russell refers to Joe Jostein.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's-
Rocket
yeah.
Jousting.
and there's a
Do y'all have?
we have most of his paper manuscripts. The earliest was a 2-volume set on how LBJ assassinated President Kennedy. So we have that, and we have a number of other manuscripts he wrote. But there were some published things too. You would know, yeah, you would know more about that. But we've tried to get all of those early things because they were done in Europe in the 60s, and most of them were mimeographed and self-published somewhere in Europe. So we try to do those, and we catalog them. So we have the manuscript is cataloged. We have a cataloger whose original catalog is not her favorite thing, but she'll do it for our JFK materials because no one else has ever done them because they're not copies out there.
Do you have some students who slip in who figured out you have more interesting things than about Bob Bullock?
I have one lady who works full-time on Bob Bullock. And Byron Tunnell, who was Secretary of State. We have his papers too. But the students, 2 students are working on just the Jack White correspondence. One student is doing all the Kennedy online stuff for me, and he did the PowerPoint. And then some other students have done, another girl still working there did all the Penn Jones papers. So we just have a lot of people working on various other projects. We also have a large 9/11 collection, and we do want to invite you to come down to Waco tomorrow. I have a lot of Kennedy materials on display there, and even though we have the exhibit is on political cartoons, 2 of the main cartoons were printed in the Dallas Morning News in November 21st, November 22nd. One on November 21st shows Kennedy shooting at a deer called Texas. The Jeep is driven by LBJ. And the next day's cartoon has Kennedy and Jackie flying into Love Field, and Dallas is up in smoke. And that cartoon was pulled right after the assassination. But we have the originals on both those cartoons. And our cartoon exhibit is 110 original cartoons.
What hours are you open?
Normally 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. We have a witness here. Mean Joe Green has been to see us many times up from San Antonio and has used the 3rd decade, 4th decade, Jack White correspondence, Penn Jones papers. Would you like to give a testimony?
I believe. No, it is great. It would be worth the trip to look at all the stuff that they've got down there. It's been especially invaluable to me because I wasn't there when the 3rd decade was being published, when the 4th decade was being. I missed all that stuff.
Yes.
So they have the Iconoclast, which is a little magazine that was published at the time that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. There's a lot of valuable stuff.
Are you still looking for more material?
Yes, sir. Our intent is to provide a haven for assassination research because people aren't comfortable with 6th floor museum. And they're not always comfortable with Dallas Public Library. A public library is not an archive, and they will take papers, but they really don't have the facilities there to process them like archives. And our intent is to put list things online so people know where they are, know what's available. John would like to do this same thing in the Washington area, but in Texas we need a similar place. I've been talking to Tom Bowden, is that right? And he has a lot of stuff there from Cutler in Connecticut I'd like to get my hands on to supplement our Grassy Knoll Gazette that we have 20 years of, that we got from 3 different people, and there are very few duplicates. We have the original teletypes from AP and UPI that Cutler sent to Penn Jones and said, what do you think of this? How much is it worth? And we have that encapsulated, but we have so you can look at it but not touch it.
Rex Bradford will probably talk to us later too. You know, and he's with the Mary Farrell Archives, and they've been putting thousands of pages of different things, so the documents went through those research stuff online. And what we want to do in Washington, D.C., and just got a grant for, is a museum of hidden history that would be the assassinations, but beyond the assassinations as well. And it would also have a research center attached where some of these kind of archives could rest once we get it up and running. But he's an existing resource, and he's got the archival skills and materials, and this is a really great collection. So if people want to go down to it tomorrow, we'll try to organize some carpooling, you know, whatever we can do to get people down there.
And I'll check with y'all at around noon to see how many are coming, to see how many bottles of water I need to freeze.
All right.
But we are not duplicating, I don't think, in any of these 3 venues what we're doing, because we're trying to put together people who've been doing the research, they've saved the papers, they need a place to put them. That they know they're going to be used, they know they're going to be professionally archived and taken care of. Everything's put in acid-free folders, acid-free boxes, listed and put online. Okay.
Yeah, we should break. We're going to go over to the Knoll, have a moment of silence at 12:30, and we'll come back here at 2.
I'm still wired.
We'll get you on wire.
Which way does this one go?
It's this hill over there.